Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan, Miami Book Fair, and all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual evening with Miranda Popkey to discuss Topics of Conversation, a compact tour de force composed almost exclusively of conversations between women, the stories they tell each other and the stories they tell themselves. Miranda Popkey was born in Santa Cruz, California in 1987. She graduated with a BA in Humanities from Yale in 2009 and with an MFA in Creative Writing from Washington University in 2018. She has written for, among other outlets, The New Republic, The New Yorker's Page Turner blog, The Paris Review Daily, The Hairpin, The Owl, GQ, and New York Magazine's The Cut. To moderate tonight's conversation, we're joined by Lynn Steger Strong. Lynn is the author of Hold Still and most recently of the novel Want. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Time, The Guardian, Harper's Bazaar, Los Angeles Times, The Paris Review, New York Magazine, and elsewhere. She teaches writing at Columbia and Catapult. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by clicking the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of Topics of Conversation from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Welcome, Miranda.
Hi.
Hi. Hi, Lynn. Welcome.
Hi. Thanks for having me. I feel like I'm gonna introduce you briefly. So I'm very excited. Miranda's gonna read a little bit, and then I'm gonna ask you some questions because that's how this goes. Go ahead.
All right. I'm going to be reading from the very first section of the book, which is set in Italy in the year 2000. And I have a stopping place that is not too far from the beginning, so this will not last very long. From the shore, the sea in three pieces, like an abstract painting in gentle motion. Closest to the sand, liquid, the pale green of a fertile lake. Then a swath of aquamarine, the color you imagine reading the word aloud. Aqua as in water, marine as in sea. Finally, a deep blue, the color of pigment, paint squirting fresh from a tin tube. Sylvia Plath writing in her journal the month she met Ted Hughes, the day before. What word blue could get that dazzling drench of blue moonlight on the flat, luminous field of white snow with the black trees against the sky, each with its particular configuration of branches? No matter the snow, the black trees, the sea was that color, the color of what word blue. I was reading Plath's journals that summer because I was 21 and daffy with sensation, drunk with it. And for the kind of person who goes straight from a major in English to a graduate program for study of same, that is, for me, the journals of Sylvia Plath, 1950 to 1962, republished that year, unabridged, counts as pleasure reading. They met, Sylvia and Ted did, in February and were married in June on the 16th, Bloomsday. That was on purpose in a dead giveaway, but they shouldn't have done it, get married. The youthful symbolism of it, or one of the dead giveaways. I was, in Otranto in August. The sea was three shades of what might have been called blue, and I was both on vacation and not. Camilla's parents were Argentinian psychoanalysts, and I was on vacation in that they had paid for my flight from New York to London, and from London to Rome, and from Rome to Brindisi, and for the train from Brindisi to Otranto, and also for the resort at which we were staying, which was tiered and terraced, smooth-walled and all-inclusive, and so theoretically I could order from the lounge chairs, whitewashed and wooden slatted, as many drinks as I wanted. Though practically I couldn't, because the reason the flights and the train and the room had been paid for, the reason I was with Camilla, her parents at all, was that Camilla had twin brothers, 7 years old, and it was my job to mind them. Matteo and Tomas. Tomas smaller and fair, and Matteo, his torso tanned, his hair dark and curly, always getting mistaken for a local. Because of the name, too. Artemisia's father was Italian, hence the spelling. They lived on the Upper West Side, Artemisia and the boys and her husband, Pablo. They were of Argentinian extraction. Camilla and I were friends, was another point in the vacation column. The first 2 weeks were the hardest. The boys had a nanny back in New York, also Argentinian, but August was her month off too. And with me at first they had mutinied, as children will do when surrendered to new authority. They couldn't have known precisely why I was reluctant to run from their room to their parents' room, double-checking what it was they were and weren't supposed to be eating and watching, how late they were or weren't supposed to stay up. But they must have sensed it, my reluctance, my all-encompassing apprehension. Artemisia had given me only parameters: not too many sweets, keep an eye on your wine, they'll try and tip it into their Coca-Cola. And a different woman would have understood this as license. A different woman would have known, from Artemisia's eye makeup, from the long shift dresses she wore, sleeveless, from the bracelets that busied her arm, slender and golden, from her sunglasses and her scarves, from the fact that Pablo had only ever spoken to me directly 3 times and never about the children, that the rules were mine to make. But I was an uncertain girl, weak of will and ego, and I wanted Artemisia and Pablo to like me, Artemisia in particular, because it was immediately obvious from her shift dresses and her bracelets, and also from the way Pablo angled his head when he spoke to me, so that his eyes, and he was already short, were looking not quite at my face, that her approval would be the harder one. I lived in fear those first few weeks that Tomas and Matteo, Theo we called him, so that they were Tom and Theo, the O in Tom narrow, closed, so that it sounded not at all like an abbreviation for the American Thomas, would run to their parents and tell them their new nanny was just awful and couldn't they send her away, like I was in some knockoff Henry James novel, some knockoff Merchant Ivory adaptation of same. And I will stop there.
Thank you. I love that. I feel like I should admit that we cheated and I asked for that because you segged me so well into the first question, which is, I mean, and also just to hear it again, I feel like it's worth saying. I read a couple interviews today in preparing for it, and you make this self-deprecating comment about structure. And I actually think this book is kind of beautifully structured, not least because I feel like so much of the book is there, which is why it's so useful to start there. And even just thinking about that first paragraph and the way that we land on blue and the way that the narrator sort of needs so many different outside verifications to accept for herself or engage with the idea that she's experiencing the word blue feels so much indicative of what I love about this book. And I'm going to turn it into a question, which is, how is this a book just about how being a woman is about the language that is thrown at us and the stories that are thrown at us, and then maybe also the stories that we then tell about ourselves?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Lynn. I am very nervous that you are going to ask questions that reveal you to be a better reader of my book than I am. But I think I have an answer to this one. It is, I do think that the novel is a lot about mediation and about how the experience of being socialized as a woman is mediated through various forms of media. And the ways in which stories from a very young age are presented to us and presented as not maybe explicitly as models, but end up being models because as a child, you're always looking for clues as to how to exist in the adult world. And especially when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, and I think definitely before then, and I think it's gotten slightly better since, but there were not a lot of options in terms of how you were going to characterize a female protagonist in popular culture. There were not a lot of options that were multifaceted, that were dimensional. There were a lot of options that existed as the object of the male gaze. And so I think, and I don't want to speak for anyone else, but as I was being socialized, I could only conceive of myself through the gaze of some invisible third person narrator who is, in my mind, going to be a man, because the man is always the protagonist and the man is always the audience, and the woman is the object who is described and who is looked at and who is judged. So I think when you depart from that, if you depart from the baseline of looking at your own self as an object and regarding your own self through someone else's eyes, or trying to, it becomes very difficult to tell what it is that you really think or believe about yourself or about the world. And so when you were talking about so many outside kinds of verification, just to get to the word blue, I think that that is a kind of, I think that that is a symptom. Just the constant need to turn things one way and then turn things another way. It comes from, for this narrator and for me, because to the extent that this narrator has an emotional life, her emotional life is my emotional life, even though none of the things that happen in here ever happened to me. But there's an extent to which this narrator is not able to understand anything except through someone else's gaze, because she does not feel like she possesses her own gaze. She can't do the constructing herself, if that makes any sense. I also want to say, like, I don't know if I can remember how to talk. So if it sounds like, if I just start putting words together in a way that is not a sentence, like, is there like an alarm you can hit?
We'll have a safety word. The safety word is Dudley. If I just randomly say your dog's name, just like redirect. That's what you do. You redirect. I think that you spoke beautifully, actually. And again, and so something I want to, so I think, again, you're saying something really smart, and you're saying something really smart. So no safety word. You're talking about this idea of the gaze. And I think one of the reasons, again, I think that your book is really structured is that we enter at this interesting point where our narrator is actually doing a thing that feels much more feminine to me than acting, which is learning to look in a new way, right? Because we enter in this first scene and she's watching Artemisia tell, I'm sure I said that incorrectly, tell this story. And to me, that feels like a sort of rupture in her life, insofar as she understands that acting, you are being watched, but there's something that she seems to be understanding about telling stories and the power or agency that lives in telling stories that is its own type of, and perhaps very feminine version of having power. And so I wonder, even like you're talking about mediation and you were talking about being gazed at, but I wonder too how this book is about learning the spaces to look as a female that are the most useful, and finding power and control that has different shapes or textures than it would were you male.
Yes. No, I think that all of that is correct in terms of her
Thank you.
learning to look in a different way. I say this also under the gaze of a taxidermied owl, which I feel like we cannot continue without acknowledging. Everything is constructed through his imperious gaze. But seriously, to be serious, I think that she is in this conversation with Artemisia that I did not get to in my reading. Artemisia tells her this long story, and she notices not only the content of the story, but she is noticing the ways in which Artemisia is shaping a story that could be read, or shaping events that could be read in one way, and sort of demanding that her listener understand them in the way that she wants them to be understood. And I do think that that is a kind of power that is available to people who have not traditionally had access to the forms of power that are more obvious. The ability to take the events of your own life or another's life or just imagined events and put them in a certain order and insist that someone else look through your eyes and absorb your perspective. I think that is a power that she is learning about throughout this novel, and sort of most explicitly in this first section. I think the problem that you run into, or the problem that she runs into, is that it's hard to invent new stories. And I think one of the wonderful things about maybe the past, 10, 20, 30 years in popular culture is that very slowly we are seeing like a widening of the kinds of stories that get a lot of airtime. But without any models, it's difficult to tell a kind of story that is different from the kinds of stories that you've seen. So Artemisia tells her a very particular kind of story, but it's a story that, if you've read the novel, it's a story that's very inflected by, I would say it's a story that is just drenched in patriarchy, even though Artemisia, I think, would say absolutely not. I think that she would disagree with me, but it's a story that is manipulating and sort of moving around these little blocks, but under this larger umbrella of male power. And I think figuring out how to tell a story that is even just moving a little bit outside of that umbrella, like stepping out from the shade of that umbrella, I think that's really tough. And just to go back to structure, and then I'm going to stop talking. And just to go back to structure, one of the things that was really exciting to me when I read the Rachel Cusk outline trilogy and just stole her narrative device right out from under her. She's doing fine. Not injure her at all. Is that was just a new way to tell a story in a novel form. And that was really exciting to me, because I think it also allowed me to think about different kinds of stories to tell within that form.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, first of all, I just want to name it because I feel like it's part of what your book is doing, which is Artemisia in some ways is telling a story about submission, right? And what you're saying about objectness, like this idea that one of the powers, or maybe one of the few powers that we have, is we being female, certain type of female, certain female, also born and raised in the 80s, although I take issue with how long you were actually alive in the 80s. But
3 whole years.
Right. So is that so submission precedes the power that comes from the storytelling in so many of the stories in this book, right? And actually, submission is something that a lot of these women crave. I mean, even from the Artemisia quotes Sylvia Plath, who she quite disparages, to your point, in a very patriarchal way, saying every man is a fascist, and our narrator kind of seems to prefer submission to not, right? So this idea that women like to make choices after the fact, maybe because making choices after the fact is the only space that they can, so that in the active moments, which to your point is often where books are built, right? Like in books, your characters are supposed to make choices and they have consequences. But something that feels so thrilling about this book is the women are like, no, I don't have a lot of choices. So instead I'm making choices where I have the most power, which is in telling stories, which is just to say, how is submission a part of this? And two, how are stories just as much of a trap and just as much of a power game as the sort of more active version of being in the world?
Yeah. So I do want to be clear about sort of the forms of power that are available to my narrator. She's white, she's cis, she's pretty much straight, she's upper middle class. She has a lot of mobility in the world, but the world that she is living in, and I think in part by choice, I do think that at the end of the novel, she's moving in a different direction. And that's why I feel the end of the novel is quite hopeful. Perhaps maybe surprisingly hopeful. But all of her mobility is within a structure or under an umbrella that has been constructed by someone else. And it's really hard for her to imagine exiting that structure. And so all of the stories that she's able to tell are going to be hampered by this fundamental constriction, which is the structure that she cannot see a way out of. So when it comes to submission, I think what she discovers at a certain point in her adolescence is that she has internalized a narrative about being a woman, which is that being a woman involves submitting. And so her move is, okay, this has already happened. Like you said, it's after the fact. This has already happened. I watched, I watched whatever movies, I read whatever books, and I've internalized this sense of myself as a woman, as an object, as the one who submits. So my choice then is I have to cast that in a way, like I have to cast that in a light, I have to tell a story about that in a way that makes me feel okay with this choice, non-choice that I'm making. And I mean, the trap is deciding like, well, I've internalized this and there's nothing I can do about it. I think a lot of the work that I have done on myself is, and the work that I think that the narrator is heading in the direction of at the end of the novel is what of the things that we have internalized are static, are fixed, are stuck there? And what of the things that we have internalized can we actually move away from and out of? So I think something like sexual desire, I think once you internalize a certain kind of like, and this is so Freudian, like there's the class, like there's the foot, like why do foot fetishes exist? Because like as a child, like you looked at a penis and then you were like, oh no, I can't look at the penis. So you like looked at you looked at it, and now you're like, okay, the foot is the penis and I'm very horny for feet. Great, that's totally fine. And I think that it is true that like the kinds of sexual desires that get internalized at a young age, those are really hard to extricate. But there's a lot of other work we can do in terms of exposing ourselves to different narrators and different narratives to move beyond in the like conscious parts of our minds. There's this sort of unconscious, dumb animal brain part of myself that is, I think, just was like permanently broken at a pretty young age. And I think that like this is true of a lot of people who are socialized as women. Like there's just like a part of my brain that hates women, and I think that I can't get rid of it. I think that I can't get rid of it because our society hates women, and like I was dunked in that little soup and I'm soaked in it, and I can't get rid. But there's a lot of stuff you can do to the conscious part of your brain in terms of like dragging yourself out of the soup and like there's nowhere to go with that metaphor.
Yeah, so, I mean, and yeah, and also that you don't hate, but you love me, right? Yeah. Okay.
But before I get quoted out of context, I do not hate women, but yeah. Our society hates women, and like there's a part of my lizard brain that soaks that up, and whenever like I want to be careful about the way that I like view and interact with popular depictions of women, because there's a part of my brain that is trained to be like, that lady's too pretty, that lady's too famous, that lady wants too many things, because that's sort of the knee-jerk societal reaction.
Yeah, I feel like, especially because I feel like this was a great response, that I should remind people or let people know you can ask questions in the ask question thing as we are talking.
Ask me why I hate women.
I actually no, but you don't, because I actually feel like there's proof of this. So have you read, I didn't know I was going to bring this up or I would have prepped you, but have you read the Vivian Gornick essay Consciousness from 1971, where she talks about the New York radical feminists?
I mean, I may have. It is not coming to me right now. So
the reason I'm bringing this up is because I read it recently, and she talks about this idea of like consciousness raising need, like the way to help women understand the lizard brains that you have just described. And one of the ways that like the New York radical feminists had these pamphlets, and in the pamphlets they gave women Miranda topics of conversation, and they told the women they could go to the meeting, and they could go to the meeting and they would go to them and they'd say patriarchy, and then the women would have to then speak from personal experience in order to understand that their personal experience was also a result of a systemic issue, right? And it's like, to some extent, I feel like that is what your book does. And a thing I wanted to bring into the conversation is this concept of conversation, which is, we've been talking about language, we've been talking about stories, but your book is called Topics of Conversation. And it's not just the narrator who speaks, she's letting other people speak. And again, and I also think that this is the way that structurally this book is so exciting to me, in terms of how, as we reconsider storytelling as novelists, we have to reconsider the structure, because the structure, I mean, I can make the bad, dumb joke of like rising action climax, like women didn't build that, and like, so we are building something different. But just back to this idea of like, so there are the stories that we tell, there are the stories that were delivered, and there is the way that those stories have been mediated through a system that feels just about immutable, right? And to some extent, I think even like the more that we know, the more language we have for it, the more it's just like calcified in our brains as like, oh no, it's so powerful. And yet you built a book in which women talk to one another and listen to one another. So how does conversation fit into this idea of language and stories, and how it's all a trap?
That is a really good question. I am going to answer it, but first I'm going to get up on a tiny little soapbox. And one of the things you said reminded me that, please, if you are writing an article, say, about a work of literature, perhaps by a woman, please don't call it seminal. Please don't call it seminal. The climax bit reminded me of that. But yeah, I think the charge of these conversations is they are conversations that are happening. I don't want to say outside of the broader structure, but it's like these women are talking to each other, and there's the sense that there is no one listening, which is, I mean, it's precisely incorrect. Like the reader is listening, right? But I think that there's a space of safety when you are in conversation with someone that you feel has experienced some of the same basic traumas, for lack of a better word, has experienced some of the same traumas. And if you know that you're not going to be challenged on the very premise, right, then there's so much further that you can go. And I think that this is why it has always been attractive to have, for any marginalized community, have a space that like specifically excludes the dominant community, because, and again, this narrator as like a white cis woman, like, is, these kinds of spaces are much more accessible to her, and she's going to encounter them much more frequently than she would if she were part of a more marginalized community. But I think one of the reasons that there's this desire to exclude men from spaces, or exclude, not have spaces that are just for queer people, is then you just don't have to explain the basic premise of this is the damage that I'm dealing with, and this is a story that I am telling, to try and not explain the damage, but explain sort of what I've done with it. and explain what happened after. And I think there's just a freedom that you feel when you know that it's not even a question of trust. It's just that baseline of, you know, we've been through some of the same shit, or like some of the same shit has probably happened to us. So you're not going to like, you're not gonna not believe me when I tell you about like some absolutely horrible interaction I had with a more powerful man who was my boss, you know, if I'm talking to you. But if I'm talking to, and I'm, again, less true now, but if I'm talking to like a straight white man who's never been in a position where sex has been on the table in a professional context in a way that feels extremely delicate and difficult to handle, I think it's really easy to brush off some of those encounters and some of those situations as not very impactful.
Yeah.
If you've never been in them, if you've never like been in a situation where it's like, I need to choose my next words so carefully, and then being in a space where you don't have to do that is so frightening.
Right. Well, and that's the amazing thing. I mean, there's that great, and I think I read an earlier version of this one too. There's a great sort of, I think of it as the wine moms chapter, but there's the chapter, you know, where all the moms are telling their stories, just to this thing of like whether people are listening to you, whether people are hearing you, whether people are understanding you as something that is deeply valued and for good reason. But also a thing that you're making me think about is just a space in which, especially for the type of individual we're talking about, who's constantly looking for layers of verification for the validity of their assertions, even if nobody's listening, but you're in a space where other people and you feel free to say the thing, right? Like that's its own kind of power, right? Because none of those moms the narrator's lying. And yet she is talking about trauma in a way that does not feel beholden to a level of self-consciousness that maybe you're more generous to our present day white males than I am. Like, I feel like most women would still have, even if they're willing to say it, there are like 7 steps of verification, right? Whereas there's a level of comfort that allows which is, okay, another way of saying this, the power of just saying the thing, the power of having the ability to just say the thing, regardless, even if the other side is hearing it, picking it up, or comprehending it. Like, how is this a book about that?
Yeah, I mean, to specifically like hone in on our wine moms, my wine moms are very, very near and dear to my heart. That is a situation where our narrator does not want to be personally known, but she needs to express the fact that something painful has happened to her. And so she fudges the details, but the essential dynamic is the same dynamic. And it's the dynamic that she trusts will go unchallenged, or not unchallenged, but she won't have to explain at every step of the way. Why did you let yourself get into this situation with this older professor, with this older man? You know, why did you make this series of bad choices? Like, isn't this really your fault? Wasn't he really helping your career? Is this actually how you got into grad? You know, all of that sort of stuff. So, and I also want to say that sort of one of the things that happens at the end of that conversation is that one of the moms is like, so it's basically a group of women who are maybe I'm imagining them as sort of all presenting as sort of straight. And the last mom who tells a story about sort of falling in love with a woman and leaving her husband. And at the end of all of the moms sharing their stories, one woman stands up and is like, okay, but like, I'm actually a lesbian. Like, I'm a woman who exclusively like has sexual feelings for other women. And like, you straight ladies like don't get what's going on with me, and I'm not telling you my story and I'm leaving. And I think it is important to like have that as a counterbalance, to be like, you know, these women are not to devalue any of the traumas that they have experienced, but it's also relative, you know. There are, again, they have a great deal more mobility than other people. But, excuse me, side effect of drinking seltzer is that you get a little burpy. I believe in the sort of performative power of language in what I understand to be the original sense. It's been a while I read three, but the idea that a language act has force in the real world, beyond just someone hearing it, that there's an actual thing that can happen as a result of a word or words being spoken. And I think just saying something out loud, even to yourself, makes it real in a way that is not the case if you're not able to speak it. If you're not able to speak it, then it remains an experience or an emotion that you may or may not believe you have. But once you say it out loud, then it's like, it's out there, it exists, and you have to look at it and you have to think, is this true? Is this not true? Is this the right way to describe this feeling? At least this is true for me. I'm definitely a person who understands what she thinks about things by like talking through them with people. It's really hard to keep track of what it is you want and what it is you need and what it is you feel if you're the only holder of that, if it's like all inside of you and there's nothing external that has ever existed. There's no language that has existed that you have brought into existence to confirm this interior reality.
Yeah, I love that. I could talk to Miranda for forever. So I just want to say again to everybody, if you want to ask a question, put it in the thing, unless I'm doing this wrong and there are questions and I just can't see them. I don't think there are. So if you have questions, put them in the thing. I will also say that a very lowbrow version of what you just said, Miranda, is, have you ever done yoga with Adrienne?
Oh gosh, I have once. I have a very fraught relationship with yoga, which we should not go into at all. But I've done yoga with Adrienne once, yes.
There's this moment where she makes you say, "I am strong," and I always feel so silly, but then I say it, and I do feel better after. A thing I want to talk about that's connected to this, and maybe just because I want to talk about it, is this idea of what you want and desire and not knowing it. Like, it's so much a part of this book, and I think that we've sort of already gone through the ways that maybe women don't know and can't possibly know to some extent what they want or desire in certain circumstances and with certain upbringings. But I wonder two words that I was thinking as you were talking, and two words that I was thinking as I was reading was, and I think maybe this is connected to this idea of like where the book lands, and this idea even of hope, is like how much vulnerability is tied up in asserting or even deciding to want in a way that is separate from how you've been told to want. And so I just wonder, like, vulnerability feels like a hard thing for this narrator to engage with. And yet, as you say, by the end, I feel her in a way that feels connected to her being willing to be vulnerable. And I wonder, like, in what manifestation do you see that come alive for her in the book, and how that moves the book throughout? Like, where is vulnerability inside of this book?
Gonna do an awful thing. So there's there's a moment in the book when not the narrator, but her friend says that telling people what you want is like giving them a set of instructions on how to hurt you. And the narrator says, I do, or no, the friend says, I do believe that. And I believe that. I think it's very emotionally dangerous to tell people what you want, because then you know, or the person that you've told knows exactly how to hurt you, which is by denying you access to the thing that you want. One of the ways around this for our narrator is to let other people dictate what it is that she wants, because it is easier to serve as a vector for someone else's desires than it is for a certain kind of person. It's easier for a certain kind of person to serve as a vector for others' desires than it is to assert your own and risk being known and risk being denied the thing that you want. And then I don't know if other people feel this shame as keenly as I do, but the shame of asking for something and then not getting it is, for me, like earth-shattering and so profound. Then it's like everyone knows you wanted something and then you didn't get it because you didn't deserve it. Or, I mean, obviously, like that last part's just me, but that is the feeling that I always have. I think the way out for this narrator runs through motherhood. It's difficult to get out of the experience of motherhood without experiencing some kind of profound intimacy in there. And I think that she is not a person who has a great relationship with her mother. And she's not a person who wants to be known by her mother or feels that she knows her mother very well. And I think that she really wants her son to have a different experience of that relationship, to feel that his mother is not holding him at a distance, and to also feel that if he wants to approach, she will welcome him. And I think that at a certain point, she realizes that she cannot continue to live her life in the way that she has been living, this extremely guarded life, this life whose only sort of exit hatch is through alcohol. Spoiler alert, it's not really a novel, but she drinks in sort of the way that you drink when you're in your early 20s, and then she keeps drinking that way, and eventually it becomes a problem, and she gets sober. And I think that, for her, being drunk is a really convenient escape hatch, because she can blame whatever it is that she said on the alcohol. I didn't mean to quote a song lyric, but once that avenue is sort of blocked for her, once that's not a way out anymore, when she's denied herself that, then she has to figure out a way to open herself up to the possibility of being known. And I think that is important for her because she has a child, and she wants her child to have an experience of the world and an experience of his own life that is like profoundly different from her own.
Yeah, I love that. You know that I've gotten very weepy in quarantine, but you're making me weepy. Zan is here for the win with a lot of questions. She's amazing. I think that the first important question that Zan has asked is also, what is your problem with? We're going to skip that one. Okay, we're going to go to the next one, which is, Miranda, you recently said in an interview that you'd want Adam Driver cast in an adaptation of Topics of Conversation. Would you want to play the narrator? Important question.
Okay. All right, Zan. Zan is my best friend, and I don't know if this was her intended result, but I mean, like, yeah, unfortunately, the answer is yes. I like sort of infamously to myself and perhaps 3 or 4 other people, tried to mount a production of the play Burn This, which Adam Driver was was in 2019 on Broadway. It's a very small play, and it is about people who resist intimacy, and it is about the collision between 2 people who resist intimacy and who knock against each other in a violent, sometimes like a physically violent way, but an emotionally violent way, and sort of end up breaking through. And it's terrifying for them. Anyway, I pretended I wanted to direct this play. I 100% did not want to direct this play. I just wanted to star in it, but then I was too embarrassed to say anything, and we never did the play. I have no training as an actress, but like, yeah, Adam Driver, if you're watching, just in case, would be interested in starring in a production of my own novel with you. Just give me a call, or like my email is available on the internet.
I feel like we should also say that, didn't you write really beautifully about Burn This for, I think, the New York Review of Books? Is that correct?
I'm going to take issue with really beautifully, but yeah, I wrote about how horny I am for Adam Driver in Burn This.
So when we find Adam's email, we're going to send him that link too, and others should read it because it's very good. Lauren Goldenberg asks, over the period of time your book has been out in the world, have you been surprised by new things you've learned about it yourself? Maybe things you realize now about it that you hadn't before. Oh, I love that question.
Oh, yeah, that is a really good question. I think something that I had hoped for it came true, which is not exactly what Lauren was asking, but if I had an ideal reader, it was, to a certain extent, my own younger self. And I did end up getting like some extremely nice emails from younger women who really seemed to connect with it, and that was really moving for me. Something that, like, honestly has made me a little nervous, and is something I've learned about the book, is that maybe it's just because men feel like they should they feel emboldened to reach out, and maybe not men feel less emboldened to reach out. But like, a lot of men have emailed me about this book and about how much they like it, and have said like, oh, I tried to get my female friends to read this and they didn't like it. And I was like, well, first of all, don't tell me that. But second of all, I'm like, like, do we have like a bad fan problem? Like, Emily Nussbaum, I think, the theory of the bad fan, Breaking Bad, and people like really getting into Walter White in a way that was not intentional, or at least that was not the original intent, to make him into a kind of actual hero as opposed to an anti-hero. Anyway, so one of the things I may have been distressed to learn is that men might be connecting with this book in a way that I did not totally foresee and am not totally on board with.
Okay, there's so much to unpack there, but we don't have time. We're going to have to unpack it on the phone later. But it's a fascinating answer. Amanda Bullock asks, have you read anything lately, define lately however you wish, which is fair because what is time, that you would like to recommend to us? Amanda's asking both of us, but you should go first. Sure, the right.
Yeah, I am reading right now 9th Street Women, which I know that Lynn loves. I know that you love it. Which is, I feel like it's I am so glad I have read it, but I also feel like it's about to devour like the rest of my year, because so Ninth Street Women is about 5 female abstract expressionist painters in New York at mid-century. Elaine de Kooning, Lee Krasner, Helen Frankenthaler, Joan Mitchell, and Grace Hardigan. And the book does a really good job of sort of sketching the scene and like giving you a real sort of broad picture of New York and the art scene at that time. But as soon as I finished the book, I was like, okay, I have to get like 5 to 6 more biographies out from the library so I can read them all. And so I fear that book and its sort of after effects are going to eat the rest of my year, but like, I ultimately don't mind. It is a book that is, it's certainly, I think it's always good to remember how close we are to what we think of as like the bad old days. We're very close to the bad old days. We are always, 2 steps away from a world in which like a painter is a lady painter as opposed to just a painter. And also, yikes, just really shoot Jackson Pollock directly into the moon.
And Clement Greenberg, if I could just help that.
Oh yeah. Was not as physically violent, so. But yeah, no, also, they can both build a moon colony. They be perfectly comfortable.
Well, but what's interesting about what you just said, no one asked for my opinion, but what's interesting about what you just said too is that like, okay, we're not so far, but also we've gone backwards, because also Roosevelt created a system in which artists could go to the dentist and make a living wage. So I think one of the reasons that book is, I love it so much, is because it shows how close we are to something terrifying, and also shows that we've built something even more terrifying in other ways. I just to answer your question, Amanda, before we wrap up, I'm reading Anne Truitt. I just read a thing that I read that I loved recently is Anne Truitt's Day book, which she was also an artist and also a mother. And also someone who struggled financially throughout her career and her life. And she just kept like a semi-regular journal for a few years in her 50s. And I don't know, give me a middle-aged mom artist and I'll read it all day long.
Yeah. I also want to recommend, like, if you're looking for, I don't know, I feel like I'm always looking for like group biographies of women. Maybe you are like me, Lynn, but I know that we both love Maggie Doherty's book, which I'm having a crazy aphasia, The Equivalents.
The Equivalents, yes.
Which is about the Radcliffe Institute. And you're talking about like a middle-aged female artist. Like Tilly Olsen is so close to my heart.
Oh my God. Yes. Yeah.
She seems to have been a very difficult person in a way that I completely understand, like holding grudges, holding petty grudges, and like writing mean letters when her friends do not have the exact reaction that she wants to a piece of her art. Like, yeah, really sympathize with that.
Yeah, I mean, we'll unpack this later and we're almost out of time. But when I read the Tilly Olsen sections, and I hope you take this as a compliment, I did think of you more than once, in the most loving way. I think we're almost out of time. I wanted to ask you one question before we go, which is just like to because I want to land on some sort of hope, right? Or like, I don't know, because it's weird, right? Like, I want to know, what's a story about yourself as a woman or as a writer that you had to unlearn to write this book?
Oh, I'm not sure I've unlearned this, but I at least had to like turn the volume down on the part of my brain that says, you can't be a fiction writer because you don't have a very good imagination. And I think it's okay that I don't have a good imagination. Like, I think authors who are able to create worlds like, you know, and I mean that not only in a science fictional sense, but like, you know, there are novels that you enter into and it's like entering into a world and you feel that you could never have imagined that particular world. And I just, you know, that's not the kind of writer I am. I'm unfortunately a writer of like ideas, which no one likes to hear. I mean, I can't, a publisher or a reader who likes to hear that less. It's hard to tell. But I did have to quiet the voice in my head that said, like, you don't have any ideas. You don't know how to write a plot. You don't have any ideas that you could string together to make a plot if you could ever figure out how to do that. I had to turn that down long enough to write a book that, you know, in many ways did not look like the book that I thought I was supposed to be writing. And that was driven, especially initially, primarily by voice. And yeah, that was a lot of giving myself permission to write something that was the thing that I also wanted to read, I guess.
Yeah. I love that. I feel like I want to land there and there's a way that I'm supposed to ask the person to come wrap us up that I don't maybe remember. Yes, there we go.
Ta-da! So wow, there is a lot in this conversation. I've been like taking notes and all kinds of random notes, but I think the whole idea of like, there are no models, I find that fascinating. So maybe you're even holding yourself up against a model that you don't have to, you know, like you can't write fiction because of why? No, you did. So, you know, it's like, congratulations. And, you know, we've sold a lot of copies of this book in hardcover. And, you know, I'm hoping we're going to do the same in paperback. Just everyone who's been watching, thank you for watching and thinking through these ideas with us. And just remember, if you want the book, you can just press the green button. We'll ship it off to you. You can pick it up if you're in Miami. But thank you, you know, for using that part of your brain and for, you know, sharing all of these remarkably interesting things that, you know, about how you wrote this for your younger self. How fascinating is that, you know? It's just like one thing after the other. It's really, I wish we could continue, but maybe we'll continue in person in Miami.
A dream. It would be a dream.
Over a drink, you know, maybe during the book fair in November, because that is happening. It looks more and more like it might happen in person. We'll see.
Wow, that's exciting.
Yeah. I daren't hope, but this is a very nice thing to imagine.
But thank you so much. And Lynn, you were a wonderful moderator.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Miranda. I love this book. And
let's get these middle-aged women artists going. Because I'm right there with you. I'll be reading too. So thank you so much for joining us, and stay safe and keep working. I'm so curious to know what you're working on next.
Oh, so am I.
Thank you guys so much for letting me be a part of this.
Good night, everybody. Good night.